The rain fell in slow, deliberate drops, soaking through the black fabric of my dress. I barely felt it. My fingers were clenched around the cold metal of the funeral program, the ink already smudging from the dampness. Daniel's name was printed in elegant serif letters, the date of his birth and death stark against the pale page. It felt unreal, like a cruel joke. A week ago, he was here. A week ago, I was still his wife. Now, I was a widow. The priest's voice droned on about love, about loss, about eternity. None of it mattered. The weight of the stairs pressing against my skin was suffocating. They weren't just mourning, they were watching. Judging. I could feel their whispers like sharp needles against my back. Eleanor stood beside me, as rigid as a statue. Even in grief, she was formidable, her black veil barely concealing the sharp glint of her eyes. I didn't dare meet her gaze, but I could feel it, burning through me. The air between us was thick with something unspoken, something heavy. When the service ended, the crowd moved in waves, offering condolences I barely registered. Cold hands murmured apologies. I nodded, I thanked them, but my mind was elsewhere. Daniel's coffin was being lowered into the ground, and with it, every certainty I once had. A familiar voice cut through the low murmur of the mourners. You should have stayed home. I turned, my breath catching. Eleanor stood inches away, her voice barely above a whisper. Her face was a mask of composed grief, but her words were laced with venom. What? My voice came out hoarse. She tilted her head slightly, the movement as precise as everything else about her. Spare us the performance, Julia. My stomach twisted. The tension between us had always existed, simmering beneath the surface of family gatherings and polite conversations. But now, it was raw, exposed. I loved him, I said, my own words feeling hollow. Eleanor's lips curved, not a smile, but something far colder. Did you? Her eyes flicked downward, just for a second. My hands clenched at my sides. Before I could respond, she turned, her black heels clicking against the wet grass as she walked away. The cemetery felt emptier after she left, despite the clusters of guests still lingering. I exhaled shakily, forcing myself to move toward the waiting cars. That was when I felt it, a slight pressure in the pocket of my coat. I froze. With careful fingers, I reached inside and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. The paper was damp, the ink slightly blurred, but the words were unmistakable. He knew. A sharp chill spread through me, colder than the rain, colder than the wind. My pulse pounded in my ears. I turned, scanning the sea of faces, searching for anyone watching me. No one seemed out of place. No one seemed to care. And yet, the note was in my hands, undeniable proof that someone knew. Knew what? That I had betrayed Daniel? That I had let myself believe, even for a moment, that what I did wouldn't matter? My hands trembled as I crumpled the note into my fist. I needed to leave. Now. Sliding into the backseat of the car, I barely noticed the driver speaking. The city blurred past the window, streaks of gray and black against the glass. The funeral should have been the end of it. It should have been closure. But all I could think about was the note, the words seared into my mind. Daniel knew. And now he was gone. The house felt heavier without Daniel in it. The grand chandeliers, the polished floors, the sterile perfection of every carefully curated piece of furniture, none of it had changed, yet it all felt different. Hollow. I had spent the past few days moving through the space like a ghost, ignoring the way the walls seemed to whisper back at me, refusing to acknowledge the way Daniel's absence turned every room into a mausoleum. Now, standing in the grand study where the lawyer had gathered the family for the reading of the will, I felt suffocated. The air was thick with tension, the kind that coils around the lungs and makes it hard to breathe. Eleanor sat in the high-backed chair beside the fireplace, her spine straight as a blade. Victor leaned against the bookcase, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The other relatives, Daniel's cousins, a few distant family members, filled the room, all wearing the same expectant look. The lawyer, a stiff man with wire-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat. We will now proceed with the reading of Mr. Daniel Whitmore's last will and testament. A hush fell over the room. The crackling of the fireplace was the only sound as he began. The usual formalities came first: donations to charities, small bequests to employees, the kind of things a man like Daniel would have arranged without much thought. Then the words shifted, and the weight in my chest grew heavier. To my wife, Julia Whitmore, I leave the entirety of my estate, including the Whitmore family shares and controlling interest in Whitmore Industries. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt Eleanor's gaze snap toward me before I even turned my head. My throat tightened. I wasn't expecting this. No one was. Victor was the first to break the silence. He let out a short, sharp laugh, though there was no humor in it. "That's a mistake," he said. "Read that again." The lawyer adjusted his glasses. "There is no mistake, Mr. Whitmore. The will is very clear." Eleanor rose from her chair with a slow, deliberate grace. The firelight cast sharp shadows across her face, making her look even more severe. "My son," she said, her voice like ice, "would never have done something so reckless." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. Had Daniel planned this before his death? Why hadn't he told me? Had he suspected something was going to happen to him? The lawyer continued, unfazed. "This will was signed and notarized 2 weeks before Mr. Whitmore's passing." Victor's fingers curled into a fist at his side. "No one is going to believe that Julia deserves control of Whitmore Industries." His voice was smooth, controlled, but I could hear the simmering rage beneath it. "She's not family." "She was his wife," the lawyer corrected. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Tell me, Julia," she said softly, stepping closer, "how did you convince my son to do this? What exactly did you promise him?" My breath hitched. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. I shook my head, trying to steady myself. "I had no idea about any of this," I said, and it was the truth. Eleanor tilted her head, studying me. How convenient. I wanted to leave, to get away from the crushing weight of their stares, but before I could move, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, my fingers stiff, and my heart stopped. Unknown number. One new voicemail. I hesitated, then pressed play. The voice that filled the room was unmistakable. Daniel's voice. Rough, urgent, like he was speaking through clenched teeth. "We need to talk. I know everything, Julia. Meet me at the house tomorrow night." The air seemed to vanish from my lungs. The room felt smaller, darker. Victor straightened, watching me carefully. Eleanor's expression remained unreadable, but I could see something shift in her eyes. The voicemail ended. The silence was suffocating. Daniel knew. And the next day, he was dead. The house felt different at night. Shadows stretched across the walls, distorting familiar shapes into something darker, more menacing. I had spent the past few hours locked in my room, replaying Daniel's voicemail until the words lost their meaning. "I know everything, Julia." The message looped in my head like a slow, suffocating noose. I shouldn't have come here alone. But I needed answers. I needed to know what Daniel meant before he died. Moving carefully through the darkened hallway, I kept my breathing shallow. The study was ahead, the place where Daniel spent most of his nights working late, always hidden behind thick wooden doors. He had kept a safe there, one I had never been allowed to touch. My fingers trembled as I twisted the knob. The door creaked open, revealing the room just as he had left it. Papers stacked neatly on his desk, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air. The fireplace was cold, the leather chair empty. My stomach clenched. He had been here the night before he died. Maybe the answers were still here too. I made my way to the bookshelf, trailing my hand along the spines of the expensive volumes Daniel had arranged with meticulous care. My fingers brushed against the edge of the frame where he had once hidden a spare key. It was still there. The safe was built into the wall behind the shelf. I crouched, forcing myself to breathe steadily as I turned the dials. The numbers came to me instinctively, our wedding date. It had always been our wedding date. The lock clicked open. Inside, a thick folder rested on top of a few documents and a small velvet box. My hands were stiff as I pulled the folder out, flipping it open. Then my breath caught. Photographs. Dozens of them. Of me. With Adrian. My vision swam. The angles, the clarity, Daniel had known. He had known for a long time. Each picture felt like a dagger against my skin. The way Adrian touched me, the way I had leaned into him, unaware that someone was watching. Someone had been following us. Daniel had seen everything. A sickening weight settled in my stomach. The last few weeks, his distant stares, the half-finished conversations, the way his hands had started trembling when he thought I wasn't looking, it all made sense now. I swallowed hard and flipped to the next page. A letter. Not to me. Mother, I refuse to let you win. If something happens to me, you know why. My breath hitched. The ink was slightly smudged, as if written in haste. I read it again, my mind scrambling to process the words. Daniel had been afraid. Of Eleanor. The sound of footsteps made me freeze. I spun around just as the door opened. Eleanor stood in the doorway, dressed in black, as if she had never left the funeral. Her gaze dropped to the folder in my hands, and then her expression shifted into something unreadable. You shouldn't be in here, she said, stepping inside with slow, deliberate movements. My heart pounded. You knew. Her lips curled, just slightly. Knew what, dear? I shoved the folder toward her. Daniel was afraid of you. My voice shook, but I forced myself to hold my ground. He thought you were going to hurt him. Eleanor exhaled softly, almost amused. Is that what you think happened? She stepped closer. That I had my own son killed? I flinched at how easily she said it, at the way her eyes never wavered. He left everything to me, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Not you. And now he's dead. Eleanor tilted her head, studying me the way one might observe a trapped animal. Then, to my horror, she smiled. Oh, Julia, she murmured. You think I killed Daniel? A chill ran down my spine. You should be more careful about who you trust, she said, her voice like silk. The person you should be afraid of is much closer to you. Before I could respond, the door behind her slammed shut. The lights flickered once. Then the room was plunged into darkness. The darkness swallowed the room, thick and suffocating. My pulse pounded in my ears as I reached blindly for the desk, my fingers grazing the edge. Somewhere in the black void, Eleanor remained still. I could feel her presence, the weight of her gaze despite the absence of light. A single, deliberate click echoed through the room, and a dim golden glow returned as the desk lamp flickered back to life. Eleanor stood exactly where she had been, unfazed, her hand resting against the light switch. "Did that scare you?" she asked, her voice smooth, almost amused. I swallowed hard, gripping the folder in my hands. "What are you trying to do?" She tilted her head slightly. "I wanted to see how you'd react." A slow realization settled in my chest. This was a game to her. A cruel, calculated test. I forced my voice to steady. "Daniel was afraid of you. He thought you'd do something to him." Her lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "And yet, you're the one holding secrets in your hands, aren't you? The photographs. The letter." The weight of Daniel's suspicions now crushing down on me. "You're lying," I said, but it came out weaker than I intended. Eleanor sighed, stepping closer. "Let's stop pretending, Julia. You and I both know Daniel wasn't as blind as you hoped. He knew about Adrian. He knew about the affair. But most importantly," she leaned in slightly, her voice dropping into a whisper, "he knew what you're capable of." My breath caught. "I didn't what?" She arched a brow. "Didn't betray him? Didn't lie to him?" She gave a slow, deliberate pause. "Didn't kill him?" The air left my lungs in a sharp gasp. "You think I?" Eleanor's expression didn't change. "I don't think anything, Julia." "I know." A tremor ran through me. The note. The voicemail. The photographs. Daniel had been trying to tell me something. But the worst part, the part that chilled me to my core, was the doubt clawing at my ribs. Had I done something? That night, Daniel was supposed to be out of town. Adrian and I had met in secret, as we had countless times before. Wine. Whispers. Regret. I had gone home late, my thoughts a foggy mess of guilt and defiance. But Daniel had been there, waiting for me. I remembered the way his eyes had burned when I walked in. The way his hands had been clenched into fists. We had fought. Words had been thrown like knives, slicing through years of carefully constructed illusions. And then, nothing. I couldn't remember what happened after. Panic surged through me. I took a step back, but Eleanor reached out, her grip firm as she caught my wrist. "You did see him that night, didn't you?" she murmured. I shook my head, trying to pull away. "No, I mean, yes, but did you hurt him?" "No." The denial left my lips too quickly, too desperately. Eleanor's grip tightened. "Tell me, Julia. When you woke up the next morning, was he already gone? Or did you leave before you could find out?" I yanked my arm free, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't know. I didn't know. But Eleanor's eyes told me she did. "You killed him," I whispered. "You're trying to make me think," a slow exhale. A shake of the head. "No, dear. I didn't have to." The realization hit me like ice down my spine. Eleanor wasn't trying to cover up a crime. She was trying to unravel mine. I stumbled backward. "You have no proof," her laughter was soft, almost pitying. "Proof? Oh, Julia. I don't need proof. I just need doubt. And look at you, you're already drowning in it." I turned, my heartbeat hammering as I reached for the door. My hands fumbled at the knob, but Eleanor's voice followed me, gentle, almost soothing. "Run, if you want. But it won't change anything. Daniel is gone. His fortune is in your hands. And soon, so will his guilt. I wrenched the door open, stepping into the dimly lit hallway. The walls felt like they were closing in, the house pressing down on me like a living thing. Daniel was dead. And maybe, just maybe, I had killed him.